work on future libraries for Warren and Mahoney, and I spent about an hour and a half on the Zoom call with Andrew and Wari Kimu, who was supposed to be with us this morning, and very interesting conversation. So Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I'm delighted to be here today at this presentation. I'm just trying to, there we go, that's great. To share with you some of the findings from our research study, 30 libraries. And this is the first time the study's been presented at all anywhere, because I haven't actually finished writing the report yet. But anyway, delighted to be speaking with you, even if unfortunately I'm not with you, physically at least. Here we are. I'm a consulting principal at Warren and Mahoney, which is a New Zealand-based design practice, architectural practice with over 350 staff. That's done has a long history of university projects and library projects, including the National Library and National Archives in New Zealand. I'm a psychologist by background, not an architect, but been working in education design for 30 plus years in different parts of the world, and have worked on library projects in the UK, Asia, Africa and Australasia. Been really fortunate to work on some very interesting projects in interesting locations. Of all the university projects I've worked on, though, academic library ones are my favourite, and I've been really fascinated by the role, the position of libraries within the university campus and within the whole sort of structure of learning, teaching and research. And it's been fascinating the way that they're reported in the literature, and that, you know, the traditional view of libraries, as you can see from these quotes here, is the library was the centre of the university. It was the heart of the campus. And the most important building on the campus. But then if you read the sort of literature after that, the sort of rise of computers and the fact that knowledge was going increasingly online, there was a lot of literature around, well, actually most universities won't need a library at all. It can all be done through the computers, so perhaps we could turn those into computer centres or something else. But now I think we're back at a time where we're at a really critical time of thinking about what is a library. And it's really about libraries' position within a changing academic world where, you know, there are just so many variables up in the air, and libraries are in a position to have a role, have an influence in all sorts of different areas. But just some of the challenges that universities are facing, that the libraries are engaged in, is the whole notion of what's happening to student enrolments, that there's increasing global competition for students. So what can the library do to help students come through the door? Actually, post-COVID, the other big issue is just getting students onto campus. That there's been a reduction in many universities of the number of students who actually attend classes, who actually come onto campus and spend time there. And this is having an impact on student success, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Also, the whole notion of what is a student and who is a student and what they're doing there is changing. You know, the average age of students in many locations is increasing. People are coming back during their careers to sort of relearn, to change skills, to upskill. And they have very different expectations for how space and time are used. Then there's issues around pedagogy, which again we'll talk about. People are learning and teaching differently, and the library can have different roles to play to support those activities. Impact of technology, hugely fundamental to the future of libraries and the growth of digitally accessible information. And that means both large-scale digitisation programs, which many libraries are engaged in to make their existing resources available online, but also the acquisition of born digital data sources, data sets, and information sources And what do you do with those, and how do you access them, and how do you make them available for the community? We'll talk also about the impact of the changes to the physical collection of libraries as to what that means for the overall design of the spaces. Libraries having an important role to play on AI and digital scholarship, and actually acting as the champion for these sorts of activities. So all in all, we're talking about libraries acting in a very volatile world. And what does that mean in terms of the future library? What are the big questions that we really need to explore when we're thinking about the design of future libraries? One of these was, well, without books, what is a library? We've seen a number of libraries, and certainly in the study, we spoke with libraries who had got rid of sort of 90–95% of their books from the shelves in the library. Well, what's left? What does it mean to be a library if the number of books is reducing significantly? Also, what does it mean in terms of study spaces? If other buildings, other types of amenities across campus are developing informal study spaces, what's the library's role in being a centre for study? And if information is available digitally and accessed through the internet, what is the role of the library in the distribution of knowledge? And then also, in a post-COVID world, what role does the library play in the campus culture and the delivery of the university's strategic vision? All of this led us to sort of really start to think about, well, are there different ways of delivering a library, being a library? Are different models possible or even likely as we move forward into the next decade? So it's all of these questions is what led to the study that we're going to talk about today, which was the future of the academic library. And that's been going on now for just under a year. And that study was funded really by Warren Mahoney because when I arrived at the company, I started to sort of talk about the changing role, and it really intrigued Warren Mahoney, and decided we need to understand that better. And the study's been supported by both COOL and CONSUL, the two associations of libraries in this part of the world. So the study's involved interviews and discussions with senior leadership from 30+ universities across a range of locations, primarily New Zealand and Australia, but also Canada, Hawaii, University of Hawai'i at Mānoa, where you are now, UK and Europe, plus a series of library visits. So the study should be completed next week, hopefully. I'm still writing the last chapter, and then we'll present that at a number of conferences, of which this is the first event. It's really clear from the discussions that we had that the library was being expected to play a very wide range of roles. And it's really interesting to think about how the architecture, how the spaces within that can support or constrain some of those roles. And you can see from the list here the diversity of roles that we're talking about. Everything from being a sort of safe treasure trove for keeping the university's treasures together and maintained, through to workspace, through to a knowledge hub, through to a sanctuary. And we'll talk about that, about the role that the library plays as a place of well-being for many students, and a space to connect to the community. And I think the connector is a key role, key aspect of the future library. The library's at the heart of everything in terms of student experience, the learning and teaching experience on campus, its contribution to research and innovation, and as an opportunity to engage with the wider community and industry. So I suppose the key point that many of the libraries raised with us, that they were feeling some frustration. They weren't understood as sort of essential university infrastructure, rather than just being a sort of cost overhead. That actually the library is at the heart of all of the activities on campus. And that's both physical and virtual. Here we're talking about seeing the library at the centre of a sort of blended innovation landscape, where both the physical experience of library and the digital experience of the library through the digital information resources come together to create this total notion of what is a library. So just to go through some of the key themes that have emerged from the future library study, I'll do that through a sort of series of questions, and then talk about some of the responses from the libraries in the study. So the first question is, well, what part does the library play in creating a vibrant campus and an enhanced student experience? Well, that was seen by just about all of the libraries, if not all of the libraries, as absolutely fundamental question that the library is a critical part of the student experience, and it supports the study, the social and the welfare needs of all the students that are on campus, and becomes really known as a sort of safe and welcoming, inclusive space on campus. And that again is both a physical and a digital space that students can rely on as a source of trusted knowledge and support. What surprised me, because it's quite a while since I've been a student, is just how important the library spaces are for students in creating a sort of home from home. It's not just a place you go to study, it's a lot more than that. Many of the students, and particularly in some of the urban universities, were living in cramped, uncomfortable accommodation, very expensive accommodation. So the library was a safe haven. It's a warm, dry, safe space with good Wi-Fi, and you're part of a community of other students engaged in study activities. So we had workshops and conversations with students in libraries where they're there literally from dawn till they go to bed at night. And it's not just for study, it's for living, it's for eating, it's for social activities. It's about creating a sense of belonging. And that's really important, because without that sense of belonging, students are likely to be less likely to stay enrolled or to be engaged in the whole sort of notion of study. So, very important role. The slight images on the right of this slide, both from Technical University of Delft, which is one of the libraries in the study, where they have a space called the Nook in the library, which is a place, if you can read the text at the top, a place for very weird conversations. It's a place where students can learn to think critically and talk and interact with students and explore a wide range of different issues as part of their time in the library. Below that, we have one of their cuddle dogs, which come in periodically for students to come and de-stress during exam periods. And that's so popular that they've now commissioned a local toy maker to make replicas of the dog, so that students can check out a dog at the circulation desk and study alongside the stuffed animal, just for a sort of sense of comfort and relaxation. Next question is, what role does the library play in student success and welfare? And again, absolutely critical to the mission of all universities is around supporting widening participation and ensuring equity of access. And a key issue that we discussed during the study with libraries was around supporting Indigenous students, First Nations students and staff. And libraries had a very diverse set of responses to that, from actually physically not doing anything in terms of providing space, through to the creation of dedicated spaces to support Indigenous students. The example at the bottom there from the University of Adelaide that you can see at the Bar Smith Library was really a sort of a community space where literature, collections of artefacts and books by Indigenous authors were all brought together into one place for anyone who was interested in exploring the First Nations cultures. So very important, but handled very differently by the libraries. And some of it seems a bit sort of tokenistic, and other ones it was much more fundamental in terms of how they think about future library spaces. Another key area that libraries were beginning to engage with in a much more serious and integrated way was around supporting students and staff who identify as neurodiverse. And what does that mean in terms of creating experiences and spaces that they feel comfortable in? The image on the top right there is a sensory space that has been installed at Flinders University Library, And that's really an interesting space because it was asked for by the neurodiverse students group and designed by them with the library, and so it's very much a space that they feel ownership for and look after and engage with. But really, what does that mean? Other universities recognise the need, but doing it in a much less co-designed sort of way. Just allocating a seminar room for neurodiverse students with lighting switches that they can modify, which was pretty less satisfactory, shall we say. But then thinking about other communities of interests, other groups of students who might have slightly different requirements. So a number of libraries were starting to think about creating family-friendly spaces to allow students to study alongside their children, but in a way that doesn't disrupt other students studying around them. I think the key issue that came up in the discussion was the sort of choice between creating dedicated spaces for particular groups or creating a really rich study landscape across the whole library that will allow people to select where they want to study with the conditions that they want around them, rather than having to identify as a member of a particular group. So I think we'll come back to the study settings in more detail, but what we came away from the discussions with was the notion that rather than just thinking about the dedicated spaces, we really needed to think through the whole architectural and spatial experience at every level. You can see from this diagram that sort of emerged from the study about the impact of the campus master plan, the building design, the entry experience, and the design of the interior spaces overall that can have on how people experience the library. An interesting thing that came up during some of the discussions was, particularly in some of the smaller branch libraries in Australia, that there were issues around perhaps the library not looking like it belonged to the wider community, so causing problems for the local Indigenous community to want to come into the space. It didn't feel like they belonged in that space because the architectural form of the building was not welcoming, was not friendly. So it's really thinking about everything from the master plan down in terms of how do you use those features to create an inclusive library. And then around it, it's not just about space, it's about library collections. How do you make those available? How do you decolonise those collections to make them more welcoming, more usable, more acceptable? And then the curation and activation of every level of those spaces around events, activities and exhibitions. The next area is around the sort of impact of the library on, or impact of pedagogic changes on future library spaces and services. And that's a really interesting one, particularly post-COVID, because COVID accelerated a whole series of changes that were already happening around active learning, around blended learning and distance, delivery of distance learning courses. But what that's meant is that spaces in libraries are used differently post-COVID in many cases. They're either used for the review, asynchronous review of pre-recorded lecture material if universities have gone to a sort of flipped model of learning, or they're being, students are wanting to use space, therefore actively participating in online classes. And obviously talking in the library can then disturb other students around you. So there's requirements for different zoning of spaces within the library, but there's also requirements for different types of space that would facilitate sort of pedagogic changes. There's increased requirements in many of the libraries for new types of study space, such as maker spaces, digital production studios, and editing suites that allow students to produce new types of research outputs or study outputs, including presentations, videos, prototypes, performances. And it was an interesting topic of conversation that a couple of the universities around the impact of AI on this, that traditional assessment methods such as essays or assignments are less valid in many cases if students can just use an AI chatbot, whatever, to generate material. So the use of these non-traditional research outputs is actually a way of getting students to demonstrate their integration or understanding of knowledge in different ways. So it's becoming more important. And what we've seen is that some of the spaces that were previously dedicated faculty use, such as media studios where they were expected to produce lecture material, are now being asked for by students as well to produce podcasts or videos or what have you. So a really interesting area of blending of spaces in different ways. And that moves us on to the sort of consideration of study spaces in general. So what role does the library have in both creating and managing study spaces? What we've seen in many libraries, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, is a reduction in the physical collection within the library. What that allows is the creation of additional study areas within the library. And then book stacks take on different roles. At one, if you were being cynical, you'd say books are becoming more wallpaper, but actually they're more useful. The book stacks are useful to create study neighbourhoods and create different types of experience, different types of space within the library. But the books do have useful properties for acoustic separation, which again is needed as people are using those library spaces very differently. So it's about using the existing library spaces, but to create study settings to support a wider range of individual study needs and preferences. What we found when the studies from the libraries in the study was that there was a need or a requirement from students for more collaborative and what we call study alone together settings, where students can work by themselves but in the company of their friends or colleagues and just get that sort of collegiate feel, that community feel that's really important. But then there were also simultaneously requests from students for a lot of additional quiet and silent study spaces, that collaborative stuff could happen elsewhere, but when they came to the library they wanted to have heads down and focus. And one library put that really nicely, and they said they'd need to provide more shut up and write space, which was a nice way of summarising it. Where there's a really interesting issue, which I don't think was addressed particularly well by any of the libraries in the study, was the connection between the study spaces in the library and the increasing number of informal study areas that are being set up in other parts of the university. Every new building project or major refurbishment tends to include some form of learning commons on the ground floor, sort of social space. Well, who looks after those spaces? Who designed them? Who thought about the types of study settings that were provided in those spaces, and who manages them over time, both in terms of just general maintenance, but also technology and curation of events within those spaces. What we found was that in many universities, those become a bit of a no man's land where no one takes responsibility for those spaces and how they're used. So students are getting an unequal experience of study settings or informal learning spaces across the different buildings. So a number of the libraries spoke about their sort of challenge of activating these other spaces and managing, but within very limited resources within the library team. So I think there's a really interesting future role about mapping campus-wide learning spaces and then thinking about the library and provision in relation to all these other spaces as well. So to sort of summarise, the future we see is about creating library spaces that can really support a diverse range of learning activities, and this is just a selection of them here, but it's not just about sort of individual study, it's about collaborating, it's about designing, it's about thinking, it's about practicing, it's all of these things. So it's about coming back to thinking about the library provision of space much more holistically in terms of all these activities. So one tool we've developed that we find quite useful is to help you understand what's being provided is the sort of taxonomy of library study settings using a number of variables like you see here. And that can help us to sort of start to map what we're providing and what level of facilities are provided in each of the study zones. Moving along to, we talked a little bit already about the physical collection and what the role of that is within the sort of university library. And I think all of the libraries that we were talking to, apart from the legal deposit ones, were looking very hard at the collections and the size of the collection and what's in them, and either disposing of or moving to off-site storage low-use items within the collection. And quite typically it was a reduction of sort of 30 to 50% of the overall journal and book collection was pretty common. And that vacated space is being used to create high value or higher value study or amenity spaces to really think about the whole library experience in a different way. In terms of acquisitions, 90 to 95% of the collection acquisitions budget was now spent on digital collections. And really the physical collection was very limited in terms of what was being purchased. It was for sort of specialist areas where, in other languages where perhaps it isn't available online, or in areas such as fine arts where books are still the preferred method of accessing that information. What was interesting though, many of the libraries that we spoke to were saying though, that despite the prevalence of digital information, the physical collections are still valued by students. The notion of doing library, as one library put it, is really enhanced by being surrounded by books, by studying and knowing that you're in an area where scholarship is valued, and using that to reinforce study activities. So it's really about how do you use those books in different ways. The two images here are quite interesting ones. One, the top right rather, is Technical University of Delft with its very famous library book hall where all of their stacks are suspended from one wall of the library. This is about 25 years old now, this library. But what they're doing is they've reduced the books by 50% on that wall. And they're replacing them with a number of digital interactive experiences, I suppose, for students where they're experimenting with sort of person-based knowledge, so knowing who the students are that are at the devices and then giving them information that they think they need, but also using it to display digital exhibitions and other spaces. It's becoming much more of an interactive wall rather than just a passive book wall. Curtin University on the bottom right is interesting also because they've moved all of their books into a glazed book stack area using compact storage. And those books in there are accessed primarily by library staff, so it's a sort of click and collect type service for books, although there's suggesting that they probably will open the collections up for students on an appointment basis, so people can still browse the shelves if they really want to. So it's very interesting sort of rethinking about the role of the collection and really about the student experience with that collection. But a couple of the libraries were doing some really interesting things to still give people access to the library collection experience through the creation of focused collection areas or neighbourhoods. So bringing together books in a particular theme into a space, whether that's sustainability or recreational reading or what have you, and creating a particular study zone where people can interact with things that have come from different parts of the library, and really making discovery easier for those in those areas. Special collections, I think, have a different future, and I think are really interesting because as things become more digital in the library and the general collection becomes less significant, the special collections are really the USP for the university library, and sort of a place of specialness, of wonder, where, you know, sort of treasures of the university are held. And what we found that in a number of the universities in the study, that they were rethinking how special collections fit within the physical library, and they wanted to move them into much more prominent locations, make them more visible, more accessible, both to the universities but also to the wider community. And what that will mean is, what that is meaning for these libraries, and I think others in the future, is about enhancement of the special collection spaces to include exhibition and display areas, and teaching and research spaces to support object-based learning and digital scholarship. So much more active, visible spaces rather than being tucked away in sort of quiet places, which tends to happen in traditional libraries. There's also an increased emphasis on digitisation programs to make those special collections more accessible, both locally but also globally through digital exhibitions online. And as I said, using those spaces to create opportunities for object-based learning, digital scholarship, and new types of research. The special collections also has an important role as guardians for First Nations documents and cultural materials, and their role, you know, is incredibly important in terms of ensuring appropriate access and use of those collections. So just some examples here is the UBC library on the top right, which acquired a copy of Shakespeare's Folio, and so they're going through a process. They've digitised it to make it interactive, and then using that to then act as the sort of gateway into a whole range of other digital applications. And then a couple of photos below, just I took from some of our library visits, of the sort of non-traditional artefacts that are in special collections, the treasures, 2 safari jackets or 2 jackets from 2 Australian universities for prominent leaders. The role of the library in respect to digital scholarship is interesting in that many of the libraries we spoke to were actively engaged in what we call below the waterline digital scholarship, which probably wasn't that visible to the rest of the institution. And by that I mean that they were engaged heavily in the creation of the digital research and collection infrastructure in terms of things like creating data repositories, developing metadata for the digital items and open access publishing, but not the sort of shiny things with advanced technologies. So their sort of role, their celebration of their skills in those areas were sometimes under-recognised. Artificial intelligence is providing new opportunities for the library, both in the library's reading or leading the university's development of ethical policies, practice, and also thinking about new opportunities for using AI to enhance research across the university. Again, back to special collections, once those the digital special collections become more machine readable, you can then use AI to work with those collections in incredibly different and rich ways to support research. We did see some of the libraries we spoke to were creating dedicated digital scholarship spaces, but they took very different forms. It could be digitisation centres where volunteers and staff were digitising some of the special collections materials, or there were maker spaces which allowed both the creation of prototypes but also recreational and craft activities, and then digital media production centres. There was some support we found for creation of spaces and expertise around augmented reality and virtual reality in libraries, but visualisation was and advanced sort of data visualization is pretty rare. And the concerns, and the reason for that was there were concerns around duplication between library facilities and those elsewhere on campus. However, it was recognised that actually the library is in a unique position on campus as being sort of neutral territory, and that there were great benefits they saw in bringing a lot of this digital scholarship activities and spaces, including things like visualization, into the library that would make it much more available for the rest of the university. The images on the right are two of the libraries we spoke with. The University of British Columbia at the top has a library research commons, which is a postgraduate space, but it also includes the sort of digital scholarship centre. One of the things that they did, and I thought was very interesting, was that they have a sort of specialist workstations and high-speed computing to support digital scholarship, but these were available to anyone at home on a sort of loan basis for 48 hours or for a week through virtualization services. So you could access the high-speed equipment from any workstation anywhere in the world, I suppose, and get access to the software that you need. The bottom image is from the Technical University of Delft again. It's their new media centre, which is really interesting because it was a part of the sort of digitization part of the library initially, but then moved on to start to explore the implications of AR and VR, virtual reality, in the library. That's grown, and they then ended up spinning off their library digital scholarship skill set into the new media centre, which is a spin-off company with 30 staff developing augmented reality and virtual reality applications for other universities and other institutions. So still within the library physically, but actually working as entrepreneurs within this area. In terms of how the library can contribute to university research and innovation, libraries continue, and the libraries in the study continue to support postgraduate students with research skills development, and that's a mixture of both online and face-to-face skills training. Typically now, postgrad students are preferring online access to the skills courses rather than face-to-face. And that's cost-effective from a library point of view because they can access more students quickly. They also, the libraries take on major roles in terms of management of institutional data repositories and development of bibliometrics and researcher profiles to support researcher career development. The postdoc spaces in the library are very variable across the studies, across the libraries in the study. And I suppose a simple way of saying it, they go from none. Some libraries didn't provide any special spaces for research students, through to the traditional library carrels or study desks, but in a postgraduate area, through to the creation of postgraduate lounges and sort of study commons. Very variable, as I said, and very little provision across the libraries for any specific space for talk masters or masters by research students. They just use the general study spaces. An area where there was very little development, I suppose, across the libraries, just a few glimmers, and was really the combination of these sorts of spaces to support research with spaces to support innovation and entrepreneurship or connection with industry. There are sort of opportunities to bring together like business incubators, accelerators with research students, but they were just starting. I think we had 2 or 3 universities that were starting to develop these sorts of activities, but it was very rare. In terms of supporting community engagement strategies, there was a desire by virtually all of the libraries to make the libraries easily accessible and welcoming to people from outside the university as well as the university community. And that's about creating opportunities for the community to engage with university activities and research. And that's both physically and globally. Many of the universities allow access by students to use the library spaces for homeworking and exams. And that was seen as very positive because it made their transition to university much easier. But it was also acknowledged that actually having joint use libraries, while it was possible, and a number of the universities were doing that, caused difficulties. They were difficult to manage because of different expectations and staffing issues. So the two images here, St. Teresa's library from Notre Dame, this is an image of their library redevelopment that's underway at the moment. What they were doing was opening up to the surrounding community to really think about what they were, how they could bring people in and use the facilities. And then the bottom image is Southern Cross Universities, which is a joint use library. But there were definite challenges in terms of bringing students from high school and universities together, because one group saw it as a leisure space and the others as a study space. So just moving quickly along, I'm aware I'm running out of time. Sustainability was another area we spoke about, and that was seen as a very important issue, and it was a mixture of both just general good practice within the university's own strategies, but also about the library's contribution to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. So really interesting opportunities there to think about sustainability, both in terms of operations, but the design and management of new facilities. Then I think the last area to cover was really interesting conversations around library workspace and who will actually be running the libraries in the future and what their workspace requirements will be. But while core academic skills are still valuable, the library workforce is becoming increasingly diverse, combining traditional librarianship with a whole range of new skills, including user experience, digital scholarship, student welfare and community engagement. So traditional library workspace models may not be the best way of delivering workspaces to support these new activities. Most library work areas tend to be a mixture of enclosed offices and shared open plan with everyone in one space. Whereas actually, a number of the libraries we spoke to were moving towards more activity-based workplaces that supported library staff to work both with colleagues, individual working, but also increasingly online through Zoom meetings and one-on-one online student consultations. So the creation of spaces that really support a diversity of work activities. So in summary, the sort of vision of the library is all about creating a space that goes beyond traditional, encompassing both physical and technological aspects. It's about creating a really rich landscape of study spaces, of research spaces, and about supporting the total student experience, about student welfare, student social activities, as well as traditional academic activities. So moving forward, from the conversations that we had, it seemed that there are sort of four key models that we could think about the future library. In some cases, the library will continue as an island, we've called it, which is the traditional view, is the library is a distinct, identifiable facility that holds all functions. Alternatively, we've seen that the library is quite often co-located with a range of student activities, of student facilities, such as catering, such as student union type spaces. So the library can become part of a hub, a combined hub that brings all of us together to really focus on the student experience and creating a key student destination on campus. There's also the option of the library as a network, where the library starts to permeate every study space on campus and really manage and curate those spaces as one entity across a range of different buildings. Or lastly, the library could contract to some extent and focus on being a space of information, expertise and technical resources, and let the study spaces go to other people in other parts of the campus. In reality, I think most future libraries will be a mixture of 2 or 3 of these different models, because I think there are benefits to each of these in its own way. So really, just to conclude, as we move forward, and I know the topic of this afternoon's conversation is about reimagining libraries within difficult buildings. Many of the libraries in the study we spoke with were in the process of, or were thinking about major refurbishments or new buildings. Some of them were having to do that within the scope of just incremental changes through general operating and maintenance budgets, but others were planning major capital developments. But the key issue is, how do any of these projects contribute towards achieving the university and the library's future strategic vision? A lot of the changes that we saw happening or being requested or required could happen at the level of the sort of scenery, the scenery and the sets and the technology levels. If you look at Stuart Brown's diagram to the right, the sort of day-to-day, short-term changes that can sort of reimagine how the library works. But then the bigger issues around services infrastructure, the structures itself, may constrain what can take place. We saw that the future is really about creating loose fit envelopes and resilient services infrastructure that can support future change, and that all the libraries were absolutely certain that sustainability and well-being had to be the heart of any future library design. So I'll just conclude with a quote that I picked up during a study I did with the British Library some time ago, which I think is really appropriate, where it's thinking about the future library, that the future library is a little bit like an airport for books or a convention centre for the meetings of the mind. So I won't read the rest, but it's a really, I think, a great summary for where we see the libraries changing and evolving in the future. And it is both physical change and virtual and digital change. It's that interaction between the two that I think will be absolutely critical. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.